Welcome to the History Maps podcast. January 1477. The frozen, mutilated body of the wealthiest man in Europe is found face down in a half-frozen pond.
Stripped completely naked by scavengers, yeah. It is such a brutal image.
It really is. Today on this deep dive, we are looking at how that happened, how Charles the Bold went from commanding the most feared, technologically advanced military on the continent to dying anonymously in the snow.
And our mission here is to dissect the Burgundian Wars. So this is a conflict spanning from 1474 to 1477 that just, well, it permanently redrew the map of Europe.
Right. We're going to examine how this seemingly invincible medieval superpower, the Duchy of Burgundy, was utterly dismantled.
Right.
And dismantled by an alliance of mountain-dwelling confederates and, cunning monarchs.
It's the story of a conflict that basically ushered in the modern infantry era, and it set the stage for the dominance of the Habsburg Empire.
And we have a vast collection of sources for this deep dive. We're talking military tactical guides, historical encyclopedias, academic papers on late medieval statecraft.
Even studies of portraiture from the era, which is pretty fascinating when you look at how these leaders wanted to project their power.
Yeah, it is a very rich collection of material to work through.
I mean, what we're really looking at here is not just a series of battles. It is a total collision of entirely different ways of organizing a society, funding a government, and fighting a war.
So to understand why that frozen body ended up in a pond at Nancy, we have to rewind, right? We need to look at the structural foundation of the state he was trying to build.
Right, because to understand the Burgundian Wars, you first have to understand what the Duchy of Burgundy was trying to become under the Valois dukes.
Specifically, Philip the Good and his son, Charles the Bold.
Exactly. And why it was fundamentally unstable from the very beginning. We really need to look at the geography first.
Because the geography dictates everything that follows.
It does. By the late 15th century, the Dukes of Burgundy had spent roughly 100 years building themselves into a formidable power. They were wedged awkwardly between the Kingdom of France to the west and the Holy Roman Empire to the east.
But the fatal flaw, according to the sources, was that their territory was not a single, continuous block of land.
No, not at all. It consisted of two completely disconnected, highly distinct regions.
Right, so you had the northern possessions that included Flanders, Brabant, and Luxembourg, so roughly parts of modern-day Belgium, the Netherlands, and northern France.
And then, completely separated by hundreds of miles, you had the southern territories. These were the original homelands of the dukes, the Franche-Comté and the Duchy of Burgundy proper.
Wedged between these two regions were independent territories, most notably the Duchy of Lorraine and various lands along the Upper Rhine.
And this is key. Charles the Bold had one overriding, consuming ambition. He wanted to stitch these northern and southern territories together.
He wanted to swallow up Lorraine and the Rhine territories, right? To forge a continuous state stretching from the North Sea down toward the Mediterranean.
Yes. His ultimate goal was to secure a royal crown from the Holy Roman Emperor. He wanted to elevate Burgundy from a mere duchy into an independent kingdom, a true middle kingdom of Europe.
And he certainly had the financial backing to attempt it. The economic engine of this entire operation was located up in the north.
The Low Countries provided Burgundy with just unparalleled wealth.
We are talking about the banking and textile hubs of Europe. Cities like Bruges and Ghent were the economic heartbeats of the continent.
And the revenue generated from taxing that immense trade network, that is what allowed the Burgundian dukes to fund highly expensive professional mercenary armies.
And maintain a court that was famous across Europe for its lavish displays of wealth. But okay, let's unpack this dynamic.
What's fascinating here is the grand illusion of the Burgundian state. To an outside observer, Burgundy looked terrifyingly powerful.
They had the richest cities, the most splendid court culture, a heavily armored military.
But when you examine the internal correspondence and the court records, you see a profound lack of internal cohesion. There was a notable absence of affection and loyalty toward the dukes from their own nobles.
Especially in those newly acquired northern territories. It sounds very much like a hostile corporate merger.
That is a very good way to frame it.
He is trying to fuse two regions with completely different cultures, languages, and political traditions. You have the northern merchants in Flanders who care entirely about keeping trade routes open.
Right, they want local independence.
And then you have the southern nobility in Burgundy proper, rooted in traditional feudal structures and martial honor. You cannot just force a unified corporate culture overnight by declaring everyone works for the same boss.
You really cannot.
It raises the question, are endless capital and military force enough to build a national identity if the local elites are already looking for the exit?
The historical record suggests they absolutely were not. I mean, we see a steady stream of courtiers and administrators opportunistically fleeing the Burgundian court.
Running right across the border to the French king, Louis XI.
Yeah. Charles was trying to impose a highly centralized administration on regions that had operated with substantial autonomy for generations.
And his own lords were losing men and trade profits to his endless military campaigns. The wealth of the Low Countries was being drained to fight wars of expansion in the south.
Wars that the northern merchants simply did not care about. This bred deep systemic resentment.
Which made Charles highly vulnerable. If your own board of directors is actively shorting your stock and leaking information to a rival company, you are in trouble.
And Charles had a neighbor who was a master of exploiting exactly that kind of weakness.
Right, the rivalry between Charles the Bold and the King of France, Louis XI.
The contrast between these two rulers really drives the entire geopolitical narrative of the era. Charles the Bold earned his nickname. He was headstrong, fiercely aggressive.
He viewed statecraft entirely through the lens of military conquest. Problems were solved by putting an armored army in the field.
Whereas Louis XI was known throughout Europe as the universal spider.
The spider. He fundamentally avoided pitched battles if he could help it, right?
Yeah, he relied on a vast web of intrigue, diplomacy, bribery, and espionage. He preferred to defeat his enemies by funding their internal opponents or inciting rebellions.
Working from the shadows. Which is why the events of October 1468 are so intensely compelling. Louis actually traveled to Charles's fortified town of Péronne to negotiate a treaty in person.
And he brought a remarkably small escort. Only 80 Scottish guards and roughly 60 men-at-arms.
He is willingly walking into the physical stronghold of his greatest rival, but the spider had essentially caught himself in his own web.
He really did. Shortly before coming to Péronne, Louis had dispatched secret agents into Burgundian territory.
Specifically to the town of Liège, with bags of coin to stir the citizens into a violent rebellion against Charles.
And it worked perfectly, but the timing was terrible. While Louis is sitting in Charles's castle negotiating peace, a messenger arrives with frantic news.
The citizens of Liège have rebelled. They captured the Bishop of Liège and the Burgundian Lord of Humbercourt.
The psychological tension in that castle must have been suffocating. Charles receives this news, connects the dots, and realizes that the King of France sitting across from him is the architect of the violence.
So Charles immediately locks the gates of the town and the doors of the castle. He stations heavily armed guards at every exit.
Louis is now a prisoner of a man known for his explosive temper.
The sources describe Charles in a state of absolute towering fury. He is pacing his chambers late into the night, openly discussing executing Louis.
Or sending for Louis's brother to take over the government of France. Louis is completely trapped.
But wait, we have to look at this objectively. Is Louis's reputation as a grand mastermind overstated here? He walked directly into a hostage situation that he manufactured himself.
It was unquestionably a severe tactical blunder. Louis overestimated his own ability to smooth-talk Charles and misjudged how fast the rebellion would ignite.
He assumed he could be safely back in Paris before it began.
Right. But Louis survived Péronne because he possessed a quality Charles completely lacked.
The ability to swallow his pride.
Yes. Recognizing he had no leverage, Louis absorbed the humiliation. He aggressively bribed Charles's household staff to calm the Duke down.
And he agreed to sign a highly unfavorable treaty granting Charles vast concessions. And to make sure he wouldn't break the treaty, Charles forces him to swear the oath on the cross of St. Lard.
Which was a reliquary supposedly containing wood from the true cross. It supposedly belonged to Charlemagne himself.
Louis considered it the most sacred object in existence. Breaking that oath was a guaranteed ticket to eternal damnation in his mind.
The humiliation was meticulously designed. But it didn't stop at the treaty. Charles forces the King of France to physically march with the Burgundian army to suppress the rebellion in Liège.
The very rebellion Louis had orchestrated. The optics of this are staggering.
Just picture it. The rebel citizens are on their walls, launching their defense and shouting, "Hurrah for France!"
Because they think the French king is their ally. Meanwhile, down in the mud, Louis is forced to wear the Burgundian St. Andrew's cross on his hat.
Riding next to Charles and shouting, "Hurrah for Burgundy!"
That is just wild. And the citizens fought back fiercely. During the siege, they launched a nighttime raid at 10 o'clock.
600 heavily armed men assaulted the specific quarters where Charles and Louis were sleeping. Both rulers were nearly killed in their beds.
It was only the desperate defense by Louis' Scottish guards that repelled the assault.
Ultimately, Liège was breached, brutally sacked, and destroyed. And Louis had to watch the slaughter of his own proxies and openly praise Charles.
Contemporary French observers were thoroughly disgusted. The sources cite a phrase circulated at the time: "When pride rides before, shame and hurt follow close after."
It was a deeply shameful moment. But Louis got out alive, and once he was back in safe territory, he went right back to his core strategy.
He realized he could never defeat the Burgundian military machine in a direct battle, so he looked at the map and decided to fund the people who could.
Which transitions the conflict to a completely different geographic and political theater, the Alps.
Let us examine how the Swiss Confederacy, this loose network of mountain cantons, was drawn into the struggle.
Charles the Bold was relentlessly pursuing his goal of connecting his territories. He needed control of the Upper Rhine region.
And in 1469, an opportunity arises. Sigismund of Habsburg, the Archduke of Austria, is financially destitute.
He needs protection from the expanding borders of the Swiss Confederacy. So Sigismund signs the Treaty of Saint-Omer, pawning his territorial possessions in Alsace to Charles for 50,000 florins.
Let us clarify what that sum means. A florin was a widely accepted standard gold coin. 50,000 florins represents a staggering transfer of wealth.
Enough capital to recruit and maintain entire mercenary armies for years.
Charles hands over the gold, takes administrative control of Alsace, and installs a heavy-handed enforcer named Peter von Hagenbach as his regional governor.
Hagenbach is tasked with bringing the independent cities of the region to heel. He implements incredibly harsh embargo politics against economic hubs like Basel, Strasbourg, and Mulhouse.
And an embargo in the 1470s was a visceral physical act. It meant deploying armed guards to block the Alpine passes,
Stringing chains across the Rhine River to halt merchant barges, seizing trade carts. The Rhine was the superhighway of medieval commerce. Blocking it strangled their livelihood.
While Hagenbach is alienating the entire Upper Rhine, Charles ties up his main military forces in a deeply flawed venture. From 1474 to 1475, he engages in the Siege of Neuss.
Against the Archbishopric of Cologne, it becomes a protracted, unsuccessful siege that drains his treasury.
And stalls his momentum. Meanwhile, back in Alsace, the economic strangulation causes public resentment to boil over into armed revolt.
Hagenbach is captured by the enraged citizens, put on trial, and executed by decapitation.
So, what does this all mean? If we look at the outcome of Charles's strategy here, by aggressively expanding and strangling regional trade, he achieved the exact opposite of his goals.
He managed to create a unified, heavily armed alliance among factions who historically despised each other. It is a remarkable diplomatic failure,
resulting in the diplomatic miracle of 1474, known as the Perpetual Accord, signed in Constance.
Sigismund of Habsburg actually negotiates a permanent peace with his traditional enemies, the Swiss Confederacy. Together with the aggrieved cities of Alsace, they form a robust anti-Burgundian league.
And who provided the vast sums of capital necessary to cement this new alliance?
Louis XI. The spider strikes again.
Louis joins the coalition via the Treaty of Andernach in December 1474. He provides crucial, continuous financial subsidies to the Swiss cantons.
He is effectively utilizing the royal treasury of France to bankroll an enormous proxy war against Burgundy, keeping French soldiers off the battlefield while letting the Swiss do the bleeding.
The sources indicate the theater of war was becoming highly sophisticated, relying heavily on intelligence gathering. Both sides employed extensive networks of professional spies.
But espionage then was an incredibly lethal profession. Spies were not protected by rules of engagement. If captured, they were routinely and publicly executed.
It shows a transition toward wars being won by logistics and early warning systems. The conflict even drew the attention of the papacy.
Yes, Pope Sixtus IV attempted to intervene. He sent emissaries to pressure the Swiss cantons to cease hostilities.
The Pope's strategy was to pacify Western Europe so he could divert Charles's army away from local conflicts and send them on a crusade against the Ottoman Empire.
But the Swiss completely ignored the papal decrees. They refused to lay down their arms as long as Charles controlled territories they viewed as an existential threat.
Particularly his occupation of the Duchy of Lorraine. So with the stage fully set, the alliance is solidified with French gold, and war declared, the conflict moves from the negotiation table to the mud and snow.
And this is where we witness the collision of two vastly different military philosophies.
To understand how the Swiss defeated the wealthiest duke in Europe, we must break down how these two armies were constructed, beginning with the Burgundian war machine.
The Burgundian military under Charles the Bold was a highly structured, complex apparatus. It was organized by a system called ordnance, meaning troops were permanently grouped by weapon types under professional, salaried officers.
This was not a feudal levy called up for a few months. It was a standing professional force.
And the composition was diverse. You had the men-at-arms, the heavily armored noble knights on horseback.
The traditional shock troops.
Right, and companies of Italian mercenary crossbowmen who provided slow but highly accurate armor-piercing fire.
And interestingly, Charles employed large numbers of English longbowmen. They utilized a unique tactical doctrine. They rode horses to move rapidly across the map, but they always dismounted to fight on foot.
That operational mobility was crucial. They screened the baggage trains, protected ammunition, and arrived at the decisive point ready to deploy their volley fire.
Furthermore, the Burgundians fielded a heavy artillery train, which was exceptionally advanced. They utilized classes of black powder cannons, including Vuglares, Serpentines, and Culverins.
Because the classes are so distinct, let us clarify what they were. A Vuglare was an early attempt at a breech-loading cannon.
Designed to fire faster than a muzzleloader, though they were notoriously difficult to seal and prone to catastrophic bursting.
Serpentines had very long barrels, designed for flatter, more accurate trajectories, and culverins were essentially oversized hand cannons or light field pieces.
Because they possessed all these specialized units, the Burgundian tactical doctrine relied entirely on meticulous preparation. They strongly preferred an arranged, static battlefield.
Their standard operating procedure was to set up their artillery batteries behind extensive fieldworks, often constructing a prepared defensive ditch or a sharpened wooden palisade known as a Grunhag.
They would carefully dress their infantry along this fortified gun line, securely anchor their flanks, and then use concentrated firepower to weaken the approaching enemy,
before deploying their heavy cavalry from the wings to deliver a shattering finishing charge.
Now contrast that highly engineered setup with the army of the Swiss Confederacy.
The Swiss relied almost entirely on a single, terrifying infantry formation known as the Gewalthaufen, or the Kiel.
This was a massive, tightly packed, incredibly deep column of men marching on foot.
The core mechanics of this formation are vital. We are talking about thousands of men arranged in a dense block. The primary weapon of the core ranks was a pike,
A heavy wooden spear measuring 16 to 18 feet long.
This core was heavily protected on the outer edges by veteran soldiers carrying shorter, brutal weapons. Halberds, which were essentially axes mounted on poles, designed to hook knights off their horses.
And huge, two-handed swords called Zweihanders. The front of this towering column would be screened by a relatively thin line of skirmishers using crossbows or handguns.
The tactical paradigm shift occurring here is monumental. For centuries, European warfare was absolutely dominated by heavy cavalry.
A charge of heavily armored knights could easily shatter standard infantry lines, but the Swiss pike square physically broke those rules.
The first 4 or 5 ranks of the Gewalthaufen projected their 18-foot spear points well beyond the front line. It created a literal wall of wood and steel.
A horse, no matter how well trained, will not run into a solid wall of spikes. The cavalry charge is entirely neutralized.
And crucially, the Swiss did not simply plant their pikes and wait. They utilized a shockingly rapid operational tempo.
Their doctrine was built on aggressive momentum.
They would move rapidly through dense woods or difficult alpine terrain in loose, flexible columns, masking their approach. Then, just moments before engaging the enemy line, they would tighten up into that dense block
And charge forward at a terrifying pace. The men in the rear ranks provided immense, continuous physical forward pressure. If a man in the front fell, the man behind him stepped over the body and took his place. I look at it like comparing a highly complex, pre-programmed machine to a bulldozer.
That is a very apt analogy.
The Burgundian army is the complex machine. It has highly specialized gears. The archers, the heavy cannons, the cavalry, they are all engineered to work in a very specific, sequential order.
But if the timing is slightly off, or if the terrain prevents the artillery from deploying, the entire machine breaks down.
The Swiss army, conversely, is the bulldozer. It is incredibly blunt, it lacks ranged finesse, but it is heavily armored at the front with an impenetrable wall of pikes.
And once it gains forward momentum, it simply grinds everything in its path into the dirt.
This theoretical clash of military doctrines became a very bloody reality in the spring of 1476. We moved to the specific engagements where the blunt force of the Swiss infantry shattered the aura of Burgundian invincibility.
The first major shock occurs at the Battle of Grandson on March 2nd, 1476. Charles the Bold had moved to besiege the castle of Grandson.
Which was garrisoned by 412 Swiss soldiers. They held out as long as they could, but could not withstand the sustained bombardment. They surrendered to Charles under the explicit promise that their lives would be spared.
Upon taking control of the castle, Charles blatantly broke that promise. He ordered the systematic execution of the entire garrison.
The 412 men were either hanged from the trees or forcibly drowned in the freezing waters of Lake Neuchâtel.
Charles undertook this mass execution, believing that a display of extreme brutality would strike terror into the cantons and discourage further resistance.
From a strategic standpoint, that is an incredibly foolish decision. If you slaughter a garrison that surrendered on terms, you are permanently guaranteeing that no Swiss fortress will ever surrender to you again.
They will fight to the last man because you have proven your word is worthless. And instead of causing terror, it hardened the Swiss resolve into pure hatred.
Meanwhile, a Swiss relief army, numbering roughly 20,000 men, was already marching through the treacherous, snowy passes of the Jura Mountains to lift the siege.
This is where we see the fatal flaw of the Burgundian complex machine in practical terms, a complete failure of reconnaissance.
Charles's cavalry scouts failed to detect the vast size of the Swiss force maneuvering through the thick forests.
When the vanguard of the Swiss army emerged near the town of Concise, Charles made a critical tactical decision. He ordered his heavy cavalry to pull back.
Because he thought he was only dealing with a small vanguard. He wanted to clear a firing lane so his artillery could decimate them on the snowy plain.
He was trying to execute the standard Burgundian operating procedure. But precisely as the Burgundian cavalry wheeled backward to clear the firing lanes, the main body of the Swiss army suddenly emerged from the dense forest line.
Accompanied by the deafening sound of alpine horns, they immediately formed up into their towering, impenetrable pike blocks.
Imagine being a Burgundian infantryman in that moment. You see an ocean of enemy pikes suddenly materialize from the trees, and simultaneously, you see your own elite heavy cavalry turning their backs and moving away from the front line.
The infantry entirely misinterpreted the maneuver. They thought a general retreat had been ordered. Widespread panic immediately infected the ranks. The complex machine broke down.
The entire Burgundian army dissolved into a chaotic rout. Charles the Bold furiously rode among his men, striking them with the flat of his sword, desperately trying to rally the line.
But it was useless. The battle was over in a matter of hours. Casualties on both sides were surprisingly light because the Burgundians ran away before heavy combat could occur.
But the material loss for the Burgundian state was absolute. The Burgundian army abandoned everything to flee, and the Swiss captured their entire fortified camp.
The resulting plunder has become legendary in European history, known simply as the Burgundian booty.
Charles the Bold, projecting the image of a king, traveled with the entire mobile wealth of his state. The Swiss captured 400 pieces of heavy artillery, vast quantities of silver plate, jeweled reliquaries, and Charles's personal command tent,
which was packed with sumptuous silk clothing, tapestries, and flawless diamonds. Here's where it gets really interesting. The cultural clash that occurs in the aftermath.
Oh, it is fascinating.
The Swiss soldiers were predominantly rural militiamen from austere mountain cantons. Suddenly, they are standing in the mud in possession of the most exquisite luxury items produced by the European Renaissance.
The historical accounts tell us that the normally disciplined Swiss troops actually rioted against their own officers over the distribution of the treasure.
Much of the priceless artwork was irreversibly destroyed out of pure ignorance.
Soldiers were seen taking their daggers and cutting up intricately woven Flemish tapestries simply to use the scraps as saddle blankets or to wrap their feet against the cold.
They dismantled delicate, jeweled religious artifacts to melt down the raw gold and silver, unable to agree on how to divide the items as whole pieces.
A few items survived, such as an archer's shield constructed of beechwood and painted with the cross of St. Andrew, which sits in a museum today, but the vast majority of the wealth was squandered in the mud.
Despite the humiliation, Charles manages to retreat, leverage his credit, and rally another army. But a mere 3 months later, on June 22, 1476, he faces the Swiss again at the Battle of Murat.
And the result is another devastating, catastrophic defeat. The Swiss vanguard, combined with a main body of over 10,000, completely outmaneuvers and crushes the Burgundian forces.
The rapid collapse of Charles's military reputation is perfectly summarized by a contemporary chronicler who wrote, Charles the Bold lost his goods at Grandson, his bravery at Marat.
And his blood at Nancy. Which brings us to the final grim act of this geopolitical tragedy. Charles has lost his goods, his artillery, his treasury, and his aura of invincibility.
As the bitter winter of 1477 sets in, he is backed into a corner.
The situation for the Duchy of Burgundy is structurally collapsing. His lords and commanders are deserting him in droves, realizing the treasury is empty.
Crucially, René II, the Duke of Lorraine, has taken advantage of Charles's defeats to openly rebel and violently reclaim his territory.
This completely severs the communication and supply lines between the northern Low Countries and the southern Duchy of Burgundy. Charles's grand vision of a connected Middle Kingdom is physically severed in half.
Charles realizes he must take back Nancy, the capital of Lorraine, to restore that geographic link. On January 5th, 1477, Charles is actively besieging the city in the middle of a brutal, freezing winter.
His once grand military force is severely depleted by casualties, desertion, and freezing temperatures. Modern estimates put his remaining army at anywhere between a mere 2,000 and 8,000 freezing men.
And marching to relieve the city is René II, accompanied by a formidable allied force of 10,000 to 12,000 men from Lorraine and the Lower Union.
And René has used French gold to hire an additional 8,000 to 10,000 veteran Swiss mercenaries.
The Allied commanders analyze the battlefield and develop a strategy that is brutal, exhausting, and ultimately flawless. They realize a direct frontal assault across the snowy plain against the remaining Burgundian artillery would result in heavy casualties.
So they divide their forces. They send a smaller vanguard to openly attack the Burgundian right flank, tying down Charles's attention and forcing him to commit his reserves.
Meanwhile, the center force, consisting of 8,000 heavy infantry and 1,300 cavalry, undertakes a grueling, physically devastating 2-hour march through thick, snow-covered, heavily wooded mountain slopes
to completely outflank the Burgundian left side. When the Swiss main body finally emerges from the tree line directly on the flank, the complex machine tries to react, but it is physically impossible.
The Burgundian artillery crews frantically try to pivot their heavy cannons to face the new threat coming down the slope. However, 15th century cannon carriages relied on crude wooden wedges to adjust their firing angles.
They simply could not elevate the barrels high enough to target the Swiss charging down the steep incline. The artillery manages to fire a single desperate volley, which sails harmlessly over the heads of the Swiss.
And reportedly kills only 2 men. Moments later, the unstoppable momentum of the Swiss Gewaltwaffen crashes directly into the freezing, outnumbered Burgundian infantry square.
The sources report that Charles, fighting desperately in the melee, was heard shouting, "I struggle against a spider who is everywhere at once."
In that chaotic moment, he might have been referring to the overwhelming numbers of the Swiss infantry surrounding him, or he might have been expressing a final, bitter realization that Louis XI, the spider, had woven the web that finally caught him.
Charles and his remaining staff attempt to rally the fleeing army, but the collapse is total. They are swept up in the desperate retreat and completely surrounded by Swiss halberdiers.
During the chaotic, muddy slaughter, a Swiss soldier swings a halberd at the Duke's head, landing a devastating, fatal blow directly through his helmet.
Charles falls dead into the freezing mud, but the battle is moving so fast and the combat is so frantic that the death of the sovereign Duke of Burgundy goes completely unnoticed by friend or foe at the time.
I have to pause and ask the fundamental strategic question here. Why did Charles, who spent his entire life commanding armies and understood tactical realities, choose to fight a battle he was mathematically poised to lose?
Why not lift the siege, retreat to the safety of the Low Countries, rebuild, and fight another day?
Right. Why make a final stand in the snow with a depleted force?
It entirely comes down to his psychological deterioration. Charles the Bold had built his personal identity, his authority over his lords, and the fundamental legitimacy of his state on the absolute projection of military invincibility.
After the humiliating routs at Grandson and Marat, his control was eroding.
His northern subjects were refusing to pay taxes, and his southern lords were deserting to France. Charles likely understood that if he ordered a retreat from Nancy without fighting, the fragile illusion holding the state together would evaporate instantly.
He felt trapped by his own mythology. He had to stand his ground to maintain any semblance of political authority. He chose to risk his life against overwhelming odds, rather than admit defeat and watch his state dissolve from cowardice.
The aftermath of the battle on that snowy field is incredibly grim. The Burgundian retreat stretches over a distance of 15 to 18 miles. The victorious Allied troops ruthlessly hunt down the fleeing, exhausted soldiers for days across the frozen landscape.
The roads leading away from Nancy are covered with the dead. Some terrified Burgundian soldiers managed to run all the way to the city of Metz, over 30 miles away.
The sources claim they were so paralyzed by fear of the pursuing Swiss that rather than negotiate entry, they threw themselves directly into the freezing waters of the city's moat, desperately hoping to swim to safety.
Only to drown in their armor. As for Charles himself, his body is not discovered until 2 full days after the battle has ended.
It has been stripped completely naked by battlefield pillagers looking for valuable clothing, and heavily mutilated by starving wolves and scavengers.
When they finally identify him by his battle scars and the length of his fingernails, his face is found frozen solid in a pool of icy water.
The Grand Duke of Burgundy, the man who spent the wealth of Europe trying to buy a royal crown, meets a miserable, utterly anonymous end in the snow.
The news of Charles the Bold's violent death meant the immediate, catastrophic collapse of the Valois dynasty of Burgundy. It sent diplomatic shockwaves through every royal court in Europe.
Because Charles died without a male heir, the surrounding powers immediately began to circle the corpse of the fallen state, eager to carve up the richest territories on the continent.
And the diplomatic fallout from the Burgundian Wars fundamentally shaped the geopolitical architecture of Europe for the next 5 centuries. Louis XI, the spider who funded the entire collapse, wasted no time.
He immediately marched his armies to legally and physically absorb the Duchy of Burgundy proper, Picardy, and other contested border regions directly into the French crown,
eliminating his greatest rival permanently. But the immensely wealthy northern territories, Flanders, Brabant, the economic engine of the whole operation, fell to Charles's only child, his daughter, Mary of Burgundy.
She is suddenly thrust into power at only 20 years old, inheriting a state that is in total political and military freefall, with French armies pressing on her borders and her own cities threatening open rebellion.
Mary's reign is remarkably brief. She dies tragically in a riding accident only 5 years later, but it is absolutely vital to European history.
She is frequently overshadowed in the historical narrative by the towering personalities of her father and her future husband, but she was a highly capable, pragmatic political operator.
To quell the intense internal unrest and stop the wealthy Flemish cities from actively revolting against her, she issues a landmark document known as the Great Privilege in early 1477.
This charter legally restored many of the crucial local rights, trade privileges, and regional autonomies that her father and grandfather had aggressively stripped away during their centralization efforts.
By sacrificing absolute monarchical power, she secured the loyalty and the financial backing of the northern cities.
And having stabilized her internal politics, she makes the most consequential diplomatic marriage of the era. She marries Archduke Maximilian I of Austria,
a member of the House of Habsburg who would eventually become the Holy Roman Emperor. By formally marrying Maximilian, she transfers the vast, concentrated wealth and territorial holdings of the Netherlands directly into the dynastic domain of the Habsburg family.
It is also worth noting that amidst this existential political crisis, Mary remained a dedicated patron of the arts, ensuring the survival of the rich cultural legacy of the Burgundian court.
Artifacts like the beautifully illuminated manuscript known as the Hours of Mary of Burgundy vividly demonstrate her commitment to maintaining the cultural sophistication of her court, even while the state was fighting for its survival.
If we connect all the historical dots here, the long-term implications are simply staggering. The Habsburg dynasty utilizes the immense, continuous wealth of the Netherlands to fund their own imperial ambitions across the globe.
This is the exact financial engine that will eventually allow the Habsburgs to dominate European politics for centuries and directly fund the colonization of the Americas. The military failure of the Burgundian state in the snows of Nancy directly capitalized the rise of the global Spanish Empire.
Meanwhile, the victors of the war, the rural cantons of the Swiss Confederacy, gained an international reputation for absolute, terrifying military invincibility.
Following the Burgundian Wars, they became the premier, highly sought-after mercenaries of Europe.
Every monarch on the continent, including the kings of France and the popes in Rome, wanted to hire the unstoppable infantrymen who had systematically crushed the wealthiest, most heavily armored duke in Europe.
We should point out it was not entirely smooth sailing for the Swiss at home. The cantons very nearly went to war with each other over how to equitably divide the enormous profits, captured territories, and the remaining Burgundian booty.
The rural agricultural cantons felt the wealthier urban city cantons were taking an unfair share of the geopolitical spoils.
It required intense negotiation and a formal agreement called the Stancer for Calmness in 1481 to finally settle the internal economic disputes, establish new rules for distributing conquered wealth, and hold the fragile confederacy together.
Ultimately, the Burgundian Wars accomplished vastly more than simply altering national borders on a map. They represent a fundamental, irreversible shift in the social and military order of Europe. I urge you to consider how the Swiss adoption and perfection of the Gabelhofen Pike Square fundamentally democratized the terrifying act of warfare. For centuries prior, the European battlefield was the exclusive domain of the wealthy, heavily armored nobility fighting on horseback. It was an elite class of aristocratic warriors who believed they were ordained to rule. But the Swiss conclusively proved that highly trained, cohesive groups of ordinary commoners fighting on foot, armed with simple wooden poles and raw discipline, could systematically isolate and slaughter the aristocratic elite. By rendering the armored knight militarily obsolete, the blood spilled during the Burgundian Wars did not just end a dynasty. It began the slow, centuries-long erosion of the feudal class system itself.
Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.